We are now back with Professor Karaboghossian, and we're going to discuss about relations between Turkey and Armenia and former President Obama. So let's go to Turkey first. Do you believe in order to improve relations between Armenia and Turkey, applying soft power is the right way forward?
A lot of Armenians, have, an almost automatic or knee-jerk reaction, which is not, very positive, and it's seen in a very negative light. That if we suggest that we should normalize relationships with Turkey, I think it's something that seriously needs to be considered. I'm not advocating that everything should be normalized. With Turkey not recognizing the Armenian Genocide, you cannot expect a normal state of diplomatic relations between the two countries. However, some progressive thawing out of relations, some progressive establishment of incremental steps on the movement of people, possibly minor steps, which are called commonly confidence-building measures between two states that are at odds with one another, in order to start relations back up and to eventually hope to build and have issue linkages where it may, at the end of the day, possibly be beneficial in the cause of the recognition as well.
Do you believe, though, outside nations should influence this process, or should it be led by either two parties? When I mean two parties, I'm talking about Armenia and Turkey specifically.
There has to be a will on the Turkish and Armenian side first, right? Having other states involved as brokers or mediators might not be such a bad idea. Now it depends who and what their motivation might be in trying to be a broker or a mediator. It's common practice in diplomacy to have neutral mediators or brokers that provide good offices, that are not invested in the conflict in the same way that parties that are, the parties to the conflict are, and having those neutral or fresh pair of eyes to draw on some linkages, to draw on some things that parties that might have entrenched positions might not see, might not be that bad of an idea.
So who should these mediators be?
Oh, that is the question now, isn't it, right?
I think Switzerland is a great pick.
Yeah. There's
neutral.
There's a lot of countries out there that have built a solid reputation in terms of international mediators or brokers for these type of things, whether it's Norway, whether it's Switzerland, whether it's our own country, Canada, to a certain extent. And there are no lack of countries that have served these purposes that could possibly step in and serve in this instance as well.
It is still till this day law that speaking about the Armenian Genocide is considered to be an insult to Turkey, or even they call it denying Turkishness. If that is the case, how is it going to work educating young Turks over there in changing their minds about the facts? Because they've obviously been fed misinformation.
Well, here's where, outside influence can only get so much mileage or traction. And grassroots change is important. And this is why, as I previously mentioned, it's an interesting time when you have an internal movement within Turkey that's coming from the Turkish population itself. I don't want to sell this for more than what it is, right? But it's there. It's bubbling. It's starting. It's interesting to see that there is internally this conversation that's being engaged in.
Speaking of movements, the president of Turkey right now is Erdogan. And last year's coup was the third he put down. And the participants of that coup were obviously jailed, and who knows what else. Do you think that's grassroots is actually working in Turkey?
Rebellion is not something that's a one-off or one-shot thing, or challenging authorities. Rebellion is a strong word. I mean, obviously, in the last coup attempt, it was an outright rebellion. But these type of things bubble. They bubble and they come to the surface. You can see this in social movements and literature that surrounds the idea of social movements. They tend to bubble, come to the surface, and then, certain instances or developments make it such that they might recede or, fail, or what seems to be a temporary setback, and, they, are pushed to the background from the foreground. Yet the literature also says that those networks upon which those are based never disappears. And it's very easy to take them up again and to spark, to get something of a spark. In that sense, you can see it as a one-off, oh, they failed. Erdogan was able to crush this particular instance, or he has in the past again. At a certain point in time, dissatisfaction might, as a result of this build-up over time, attempts and failures, actually reach critical mass. And when it does, it's going to be difficult for a government like his to be able to successfully put down one of these when that critical mass is reached.
It's been obviously, it's almost 102 years. Recently, of course, we've been conducting massive protests, such as the one in Ottawa every year. And we are in the hopes that the message will be well received and it will change their minds sometime soon. Yet, we have been doing protests for quite some time. Do you believe that's the right way to go forward? Or should we alter our tactics with regards to protests? Because at the end of the day, it could be possible that no one really with that type of influence is actually in the Turkish embassy in Canada.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I don't think that there's any real expectation that one day on April 24th, when we finally end the march in front of the Turkish embassy, and the Armenian delegate or representative that walks in and requests that the genocide be recognized, I don't think there's any reasonable expectation that if there ever was or there is today, that we're going to get a positive response there and they're going to say yes, right? So I think that a lot of these things are symbolic and they have more educational impact and effect. Social movements have a diversity of instruments and tactics at their disposal. And protests are one that draws attention. I, for one, being an Armenian from Montreal, have gone through the rite of passage of going to April 24th marches from Montreal to Ottawa every year as a child and as a young adult and as an adult, taking my own children these days, to pass on that custom or tradition. And I don't think that needs to be stopped. What I would advocate, however, is that any good social movement that succeeds or makes a lasting impact in terms of meeting its objectives use diversified tactics. So it's not a question of that being wrong. It's not a question of that being needed. We need to abandon that. No, not at all. I mean, I went last year or the year before it was, and walking the streets, I still noticed tons of people in Ottawa wondering who these people are. Why are they marching? What are these signs saying and what do they mean? So that in of itself has a certain effect. People will ask themselves, maybe get informed and disseminate. It's not really for the Turkish embassy, really. There's a larger, audience here, including media, news stories and whatnot. So that needs to continue, but the diversification of tactics and other instruments has to come and obviously complement. You can't put your eggs in one basket.
That's true. But when discussing about that basket full of eggs, many outsiders who are witnessing our protests would criticize, and they do, that as Armenians we're a one-issue people. Would that be the case? Or in other words, how do we refute that perception of us?
You know, a one-issue people, it's an interesting characterization. There is no question that we are very, heavily defined by the genocide, and why would it be otherwise, especially that it's not recognized yet officially by the perpetrators of the act, okay? Yet, you and I both know that that's not the only thing that defines us as Armenians. Long-standing history with Christianity, the oldest Christian church on the planet, certain cultural and customs and traditions, dietary habits, dress, clothes, eating too much, being too loud, so there are cultural traits and characteristics that go beyond, right? But there's no question that that feeds into, defining who we are as Armenians and into our multiple identities. So, when people characterize this as a one-issue people, I don't know what they're trying to achieve or what they're trying to say or what that really means.
Okay. To that effect, though, let's be hopeful and say that the Turkish government finally recognizes the Armenian genocide. A lot of us are under the assumption that the next step would be compensation, reparations, as well as getting our lands back. Mm-hmm. Would that be actually the case, or is it too idealistic to think that?
Well, this is one of the major stumbling blocks and hurdles, I think, in reality. I mean, I can't say for sure, but, if we were able to be a fly on the wall in the corridors of power, is major resistance and recognition is probably the ramifications or the consequences of possibly opening up the door to claims of reparation, claims of restoration of property, claims of compensations for survivors or their families. So, yes, that seems to be, a cause for concern, obviously, for the Turkish authorities. Now, whether or not that's possible, well, I think if it is, it'll be gradual. When the day occurs or comes that the Turkish government finally recognizes and comes to the wisdom and the vision and the courage, to recognize its moral obligation and duty to come to terms with its acts and the Armenian genocide, that all of a sudden they're going to say, oh, well, yes, well, here's all your land back, here's, restitution, here's reparation. Those things will be subject to negotiation, and a certain sensitivity will have to be demonstrated, or would have to be demonstrated, in the speed that we would expect that those things might. There'll be roadblocks. There'll be steps back, steps forward. So yes, there could possibly be hope for that to occur, but it has to be very measured and reasonable.
You mentioned hope, and when you say hope, I think of yes, we can, which brings us to former President Obama. But before tackling Obama, I want to talk about former Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice. During the Bush administration, was quite hesitant and reluctant, as many politicians usually are, to call the Armenian genocide as such, but rather a tragedy. With President Obama, when he was at the time senator in 2007, he was campaigning to Armenians, especially in LA, and he made a promise that under his administration, the Armenian genocide would finally be recognized. And yet, obviously, as we've noticed, the last 8 years or so, nothing really substantial has happened. Why do you think this is the case?
It's easy when you're outside the confines of power, trying to curry support from various groups and constituencies to make promises about certain things. And then when you get into the confines of power, you start realizing, the constraints that ruling has. The vested interest of, people that have been in the background, groups, lobby organizations, business groups, advocacy groups, you name it, the American political system is a complex collection of these type of groupings that all try to influence government and full of vested interests. So in that sense, right, once you get there, you also realize what your alliances are like internationally. And language becomes important in terms of saying something to characterize an event, and using the totally and wholly accurate word of genocide to characterize it might be touchy, might offend the sensibilities of certain people. During the Obama administration, the alliance between Turkey and NATO members and the United States was still somewhat on solid footing before the coup was suppressed. Late into Obama's administration, where impacts in terms of diplomatic relations might have occurred between the U.S. So that could go a long way in explaining. And again, here's not to be repetitive or redundant, political expediency, political interest that ends up trumping the requirements and the predicaments of truth, justice, moral obligations, and rectitude.
All right. This is why it is a complex issue. Thank you so much, Professor.
It was a pleasure.
Thank you.